What's up, everyone? Sorry for the lack of posting for the past couple weeks. I got engaged and I'm also in the process of cleaning out my studio, which is why I am not filming in the studio right now. My name is Josh Ramos. I'm the executive producer of Wolf Cry Productions, and today we're going to be going over two very essential lenses if you are shooting with the Canon EOS R. That's basically just what all these are going to be about. Yeah, so the first lens that we're going to be looking at is the Canon 35mm f1.8 macro stem lens. And basically, I just recently picked this one up. I actually got it for the engagement just because it was the easiest way to get Lindsay out and about, because whenever I get a new lens, normally we do a photo shoot with it. So yeah, the 35mm is the new one, and then the 50mm lens, which is also a stem lens, and a 1.8 f-stop. Yeah, these are two very crucial lenses, especially if you're just getting into portrait photography or video production. And I'm just gonna basically just jump right into all the tests that I did, because you guys know how much I love doing tests. I'm gonna talk about the 35mm real quick. So basically the 35, you do have your autofocus and manual focus dial, and you have the stabilizer, which is really nice because the 50mm does not have stabilizer built in. You also have your focus ring and a control ring, which it has some dials, which is really nice because then you can actually feel the stops. I have my control ring set for the ISO, so it is nice to be able to hear the ISO clicking. The 50 is a little bit different. You actually have a dial that does the focus or control ring, and you would switch the dial depending on what you want. And then the control ring doesn't have any stops because it's also for the focus. Honestly, it's not horrible. I can see it being more of a complication if you were doing filmmaking with it. I mainly do photography with kind of both of these lenses, actually, because I do have other lenses that I use when it comes to video production. The ring hasn't really, slowed me down at all. Like I did adjust to it pretty quickly. I rarely do the manual focus when I'm doing photography. I mainly just do the autofocus, so I don't really have it ever on the focused part of the dial. It's usually on the control, and then I'm just controlling my ISO from there. So those are the two biggest differences of the Canon 35 and the 50 as far as just how they look and what they can do. The first thing that I wanted to do, obviously, was look at the difference in photo quality. So the first thing that I did, I have this yellow fluffy ball, and I thought it would be a cool idea to kind of use that as an example of the amount of detail that are in the 35 and 50mm lens. So these were both taken in the same exact spot on a tripod. Obviously the one on the left is going to be the 35 and the one on the right is going to be the 50. So I'm just going to zoom in here. And yeah, you can see there is very little difference as far as detail. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it on your screens, but it does look like the 35 is a little bit more crisp, but it's still unbelievable how much detail you can actually see in all of this. I do see a little bit of noise. It actually looks a little bit bigger again in the 50, but the 30 seems to be not horrible. How is the vignetting? So I do see, is this the 35? Yeah, so there is some vignetting on the 35, not as much on the 50. And if we were to move these, you can still see a little bit of the vignetting, but not as much, obviously. One thing that I did notice too, if you are editing in Lightroom, is that the 35 does have the profile correction already built in, whereas when you go to the 50, you have to just tell it that it's Canon, and then it'll go to the 50 1.2 USM lens, which isn't this lens, but it does look like it does pretty good correction. But overall the details are actually pretty similar. The biggest difference that you were going to see is obviously just going to be your the range, or just basically how wide the angle is. So let's jump into the next test. What I did here, I just went outside. Well, I didn't really go outside, this is out on the balcony. But yeah, you can see that the details again are actually pretty similar. Like down in the shadows of the trees, you see not a huge difference. I will say though, like up close, 35 does show a little bit more detail. Actually, no, the 50 doesn't have a horrible. I would say that the difference isn't even crucial. It all looks really good. Let's just look at some fringing, if any. I see a lot of fringing on the 50, and a lot of it is magenta. I really don't see a whole lot. I mean, I see some magenta fringing on the 35, but I also do see some green. So at least with the 50, you really only get one color, but it looks like with the 35, you get both. I guess in places where there is a lot of fringing on the 35, it's a lot. I think the 50 is just more noticeable. Actually, I don't know. They're both about the same. Oh yeah, see there it is in the 35. So I guess as far as fringing, the 50 isn't as bad. There is obviously a lot more magenta, but the 35 has magenta and green in it. Obviously these are super easy things to fix in Lightroom. All right, so that's gonna be it for the photo test. I know those were two very basic tests just as far as fringing and detail. If you're trying to decide between the two based off of quality and detail, they're almost exactly the same. It's really just going to be down to what you need. Do you need more of a wide angle 35 for portrait photography, landscape photography? The 50 is also really good with portrait photography. I got examples of both. So here are just some photos that I shot with the 50mm. And here are some photos that I shot with the 35mm. I use the 35 mainly when it comes to portrait photography that has more scenery. So like those photos at Letchworth or with my buddy walking on the trees, that kind of stuff. It was nice to have the 35 because the 50 probably wouldn't have gathered as much information. Now on to the video difference. And this is probably going to be your deciding factor if you are contemplating which lens you should buy, because there are some pretty big differences when it comes to the video aspect of it. And like I said, 35 has stabilization. If you're trying to do video work, that's going to be a huge benefit. The 50 does not. So I'm going to do stabilizing test for both of these, and you guys are going to watch that right now. In the 50, you also have one control ring to do either the focus or whatever your preset is. So I don't know, that might be a little bit more frustrating, because I know when I shoot video, I would say 95% of the time I shoot in manual focus, just because nothing ruins a shot more than when the focus shifts onto something else and it just doesn't look professional. So let me do what the first test was. And basically it's the yellow ball again. And I'm just gonna be looking at the detail of everything. Now, some of you guys also may know that with the Canon EOS R, when you shoot in 4K, there is that 4K crop. So here are just some samples of that yellow ball again with the 1080p and the 4K, and then I can show you basically what it's cropping. I really don't think that there's a huge difference as far as quality. The biggest difference that you are going to see with these shots are just how wide your angle is, basically. Yeah, the 4K crop on the 50mm is going to be drastic because now you're basically shooting on 100mm. If you are looking for a way to not have crop, use an EFS lens and get yourself a converter. That's what I shoot when I do these videos. I actually have the EFS 18 to 135mm lens, and I can shoot in 4K and there's no crop, just because that lens is already cropped, so it cannot crop more. And yeah, it's helpful, but obviously EFS lenses aren't always the greatest quality, but if you're shooting in 4K and exporting in 1080p, quality is going to be pretty good either way. Now here's the big thing, the autofocus. Autofocus is a fun little test to do, and it's actually pretty surprising what these things are capable of doing. So both of these lenses do have what you would call a quiet mode, where you can hear the autofocus on both of these when you're doing photography, and it's really, really loud, but it knows when your camera's in video mode, and the autofocus is actually a little bit more quieter. So we're gonna take a look at the focusing capabilities of both of these. So this is the 35mm. A little quiet. You can hear a slight little hum to it as it's focusing. Overall, not too bad. It is pretty smooth. All right, now we're gonna get into the 50. You can hear a lot of noise with the 50mm doing the autofocus in video mode. It's not as loud as the photography one, but it is still pretty annoying. The microphones will pick it up, so that's just something to be mindful of if you have the 50. Whereas the 35mm, if you have a lav on your subject and you're pretty far back, I don't think it's gonna pick up the sound at all. But with the 50, you will hear it a little bit. Now let's do how fast it can focus with photos. So I don't have any technology that allows me to screen record my camera screen, so I had to use my iPhone. So this is just how fast it is. The 35 is absolutely insane when it comes to the autofocus. It is so fast that I couldn't believe how fast it was actually going. And then when I continued to do the test, it was basically by the time I had the first box lifted up, it was already focusing on the next one. So the autofocus, the audio is picked up on external microphones with the 50mm, as you can see from the iPhone. And then the 35, you can barely pick it up with the iPhone, but you can pick it up in camera. So when it comes to video, obviously that is very important to know, because you don't want to have autofocus on if you plan on using audio from the camera, because you're just going to hear the buzz, bzz, bzz, bzz. So that's always a thing. However, the 50mm does autofocus faster in the video stuff. That's only because the 35 moves slower so that it's not as noisy. but it's only by a few frames. So overall, I would say that the 35 is a lot more user friendly, just because you do have the dial of the control ring and you have a focus ring separately. You also have the stabilization, auto and manual focus, whereas the 50 millimeter you have focus and then control. And if you want to switch between manual focus and autofocus, you have to do that in the camera, which is a little bit annoying. And again, if you're doing it for video, it's probably super annoying. If you're doing it for photo, I usually just use autofocus anyways and don't really have to move that around, and I keep it on the control. So I guess it really just comes down to what you need. If you are doing landscape and portrait photography, 100% go with the 35. If you are doing video work, 35. And if you're just doing portrait photography but you're not really into landscape, the 50 all the way. However, both of these together are an incredible team, so I'm definitely going to be using both. I love using both. I would probably use the 50s more when it comes to just portrait, but if I'm trying to get a lot of the scenery around my subject, then I'm going with the 35. So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you found it helpful. If you did, please leave a like down below and subscribe for more. I do post weekly, except for the past couple weeks because I've had a lot going on. Comment if you have any questions about anything, or if you have any ideas of what you want to see next. I do plan on making a video of all the equipment that I have, just so that you guys can see. Yeah, guys, that's it. Thank you. Bye.